final plenary session of the day, followed by a reception, which we would love to see you all at. But to kick off this conversation, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome and introduce Macke Raymond. Macke has served as the director of Credo since its inception, and for those folks who don't know, I have been saying Credo is the gold standard of charter school studies. Many other things as well, but for the folks in the room, when you hear high quality studies referenced about charter schools, they are by and large coming from Credo and the talents of this lady that it is my privilege to be seated with up here. Macke has steered Credo to national prominence as a rigorous and independent source for policy and program analysis. She's done extensive work in public policy and education reform, and is currently researching the development of competitive markets and the creation of reliable data on program performance. She also leads Credo in investigating the effectiveness of public charter schools. As I just said, I should have been reading my script the entire time. Prior to joining Stanford in 2000, she held faculty positions in the political science and economics departments at the University of Rochester. Can we get a little Rochester in the house? Yeah, that's right. Macke also worked for a number of years in the telecommunications industry and was president of Raymond Associates, a private consulting company specializing in public policy research projects and telecommunications policy formulation from 1985 to 2000. So please join me in welcoming. Thank you for being here. So, Macke, to start, so you founded Credo back in 1999, which is really at the beginning, the very early days of the charter movement when it had barely begun in many states. What was its initial purpose?
So our first incarnation was to try to go around to state education agencies, which at that time didn't do anything looking at outcomes or impact or evaluation at all, and try to convince them that if they were spending billions of dollars on education, wouldn't they like to know if it worked? And do you know what I got? I got a resounding no. So for like the first year and a half, I just beat my head against this one topic. And finally I said, well, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. And so we repivoted and we became basically, instead of a research advocate, an advocate for research, we decided we would produce some research and see if we could shame people into doing more of it. And 20 years later, here I am.
And so at the risk of asking you, here on the stage to give a referendum on 20 years' work, how did that strategy play out? Were those folks, who has been effectively shamed?
Well, so a couple of different things have happened in the 20 years, and I claim no credit for any of this. One, you had federal legislation that required that we actually know what happens to kids. And so we had this big pivot from just counting how many inputs schools got to actually what happened to them. And that was the one big contribution of No Child Left Behind, in my view. And we also have the technology evolution of longitudinal data systems where you're actually able to figure out what's happening with kids and collect that information. And so the combination of those two things finally put states in a position where they have these troves of data, and researchers started knocking on the door. We were some of those researchers, but others as well. And getting states to understand that they could actually learn things from that data has been a really big sea change. And so now, there's nobody from NICET in the room, right? Now, there will be, well, later, I'll deny that I said this, but states are very eager to hold researchers hostage, right? You want the data? Here's the question I want you to look at. And so there's a whole big bartering process now where teams like mine will go and we say, well, here are the things we want to do, and they're like, well, if you want that, then here are the other things you have to do. And so it's a little bit of a quid pro quo arrangement, but it works, right? So the idea is you want to do more of your stuff and less of their stuff, right? There's a balancing game there, but many states now. So I can say New York State is very interested in having researchers look at the data. Michigan, Florida is very big, Texas, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. The big states are really keen on it. My state of California, absolutely not. Like, they make it so incredibly impossible to get anything, any permission to use the data. And the conditions under which you are allowed to use the data are so onerous that There are very, very few researchers doing anything in California, and the department seems to be very happy about that.
And how did charter schools play into that evolution for Credo and in general? And so how did it come to be that the Credo study is sort of synonymous with a best-in-class, rigorous evaluation of charter schools that not exclusively, not entirely, but significantly have been some of the places that have really articulated the value and the learning gains for charter students?
Yeah, so I actually started looking at charter schools at the request of the Walton Family Foundation, and this actually was before any of these longitudinal data systems existed. And so they asked us to go, and maybe some of you in the room were part of this, go and give schools student information systems. We bought a massive number of licenses for Power School and actually trained people how to adopt and how to move their data in. And the deal was, we'll get you this system and we'll get you up and running on it, but then we get your data so that we can evaluate the places that Walton had put money. And by the time I did that work, my team did that work, we realized we're already in 7 states, we might as well just keep going. And so we started having conversations with state agencies about getting more data on more schools, and pretty soon we were up in the first study we did, we were 17 states. The second study, we were 27. We're now at 34 states, all of whom are really interested in not only understanding how their own charter schools are doing, but really what they want to do is they want to spy on the next state over, right? The benchmarking is really where the action is for them. They want to know where they stand, and there's no other place to get that information. So we are the only place in the country that actually has these multiple data agreements, and I can tell you there's a reason for that, and that's because it's just such a pain to do. It takes so much time and so many negotiations to get a single state to yes, much less many states to yes, that we have a resource now that we are using for charter schools and for some other things too, that just is the only place. If you really want to know what's going on in charter schools around the country, there aren't that many places you can go.
And why do you think that is? Why is it so hard to get these agreements, let alone so many of them?
Well, there's a delicate balancing act that each researcher has to do, as I mentioned before, about making sure that what they want to look at is actually of interest to the states. The states are under no obligation to sign an agreement with any researcher. FERPA, the law that governs all of data privacy, gives states discretion, but does not compel states to share data. And so it is all about making a compelling case that what you want to look at is something that they want to know about. And frankly, that's a long, protracted thing. Lots of researchers want to find existing data sets and just get going. They don't want to take the time to do the negotiations or to clean the data or to put the data sets together. I can say there are a lot of researchers who would like to come and sit in my lap and use my data. And that's a continuing conversation about how much money, how much proprietary control do I actually have over these data? And my answer is, you can get the data as easily as I can. And at that point, whatever you want to do with the data, that's yours. And whatever I've done with the data, that's mine. But the opportunity for us to actually weigh in on a number of questions about charter schools. It's not just, how are your kids doing versus kids in district schools, but a lot of really important questions around the way schools are organized and whether there are particular pockets where schools are doing better than in other places. Those are the kinds of things that we're interested in, and states are too.
And so for charter folks, the folks in this room, what would you say, and this is potentially a large task, to again, look back over the course of 20 years and say, if you had 2 to 3 major takeaways that were sort of specific to charters, what would you say that they are?
Yeah, that's a great question. Number one, I think you have an identity crisis on your hands. You don't seem to embrace the fact that you are the largest school reform effort ever in the history of the United States. You don't identify with that and you don't own that, but it's true. And in that context, there isn't enough attention to the findings that we find the most compelling, which are that while on average charter schools are a little bit better than the school down the street, that there are really important hubs of dramatically better schools, and that those are schools that I think ought to be really studied hard. So we know that urban schools do substantially better for their kids than those kids would get in district schools. We know that there are a number of extremely high-performing schools across the country, and I would say they're not just CMOs. So many of these really top schools are independent schools as well, and they're educating kids to the point where they're well above the state average, and their growth compared to the school down the street is just dramatically better. There are hundreds and hundreds of those schools, and they are really telling a story about what the possibilities are for public education. Many of those are in urban areas, but many of them are not. And so regardless of where you sit in the charter school landscape, I think that there are really, really important examples that we're not doing enough to really harvest. And I want to really encourage that for the movement to continue and to thrive and to be effective in the defense against all of the opponents, there's got to be a much bigger effort to really dig into and learn from the schools that are really knocking it out of the park and see what can be done to adopt some of that in more schools.
Say more about this idea of identity crisis, right? Or this, what would it look like if folks in this room walked out of here and into the networking reception saying, we are the biggest effort to reform one of the largest bureaucracies in one of the largest economies in the world. Like, what would be different at that point?
Well, I think three things. One, I think the day-to-day work that you do is incredibly important, and I know that it is consuming. But I think that there would be an additional focus on a much different kind of communication and messaging, not only to your peers in other schools, but also outward into the community. I think you would be much less insular in each of you going into your own schools on Monday and not coming out until Friday or maybe Saturday morning, depending on how bad Friday was. And I think that there would be more of a engagement with building really strong bases of support in your immediate community, in your parent community, in your business community, in the faith community, really just bringing the outside in to understand how valuable this asset is, not just for the kids in the seats, but actually as part of this larger identity. I think the second thing that would happen is that there would be a very different appetite for both small p politics and big P politics. And I have to say my biggest fear for the schools that we look at and that we study, and I'm sitting in California, which just came out of a really awful legislative season that had a huge amount of impact. I see Jed Wallace here, I'm sure you can talk about that better than I can. But that's not a one-off. That's going to be the status quo for the next 10 years. And so being prepared to be a strong defender of the right to exist, the right to transform education, the right to demonstrate that there are better ways for education policy people to allocate resources and to think about the organization of school and to demand that policymakers take those different alternatives more seriously, I think would be the second big change that you'd see if this idea that I have about changing your identity caught on.
Well, speaking as the head of two state associations, I agree. And this was not scripted. I have questions, but not a script. And so, thank you. As you look back over the course of the last 20 years and the evaluation and what you've looked at it for charter schools broadly, tomorrow over lunch we have some charter school founders who are going to talk about their evolution, their school's evolution, and their lessons learned. over a fairly long time period. What would you say, from your perspective, have been some of the most notable evolutions of the charter school sector or lessons learned? And are there others that you would say, aside from some of this identity and engagement, when you look at the data that charter schools should continue to learn and need to evolve on?
Well, so the biggest pivot that I have seen, and I've seen it in the data, is that for the first literally 10 or 15 years of the movement, it was a quantity game, not a quality game. And there was a lot of emphasis on just getting schools started. From an economics perspective, from a building the competitive entrant sector, it made a lot of sense. But ultimately, the thing that saves the movement is that there's a quality advantage. You really only have two advantages that you can play off of. One is that you produce a far superior product, or the other is that you are so much cheaper that you provide an efficiency alternative. I don't think anybody wants to go to that point. That's not a politically feasible place to be. But that means then that it has to shift to a quality game. And I've been very impressed with folks who got into the business sort of basically to build up the numbers, doing that pivot and doing the continuous examination, continuous improvement, small changes here and there and here and there and here and there to their model, and really using information from assessments and from teacher feedback and parent feedback to really refine the model of how they approach their school. I've seen individual schools be able to move pretty intently on an improvement trajectory. I have to say it's a minority of schools, and so another message to bring here is that I think a really important piece here is just constantly trying to take that one next step, find out the next thing that you're going to do to try to improve, because I do believe that this is a longer game that absolutely that requires demonstration that you are on a continuous improvement path and that it's being effective.
Yeah, and so just to link that to something that you said earlier, and at the risk of putting you on the spot, but this is a question that I get a lot from schools that want exactly that. Who should I be looking at? Who should I be talking to? Who should we be modeling ourselves after? And I think a lot of folks in here who do go into their schools on Monday and come out as soon as they can, whether that's on Friday or Saturday. But I talked to one charter leader and they said, it's dark when I get there and it's dark when I leave. So at the risk of putting you on the spot and asking you to either name names or describe some characteristics of the types of schools that if someone here was saying, that's me, I want to be on that path, but I don't know how, and I don't even know where to look. I believe what you're saying about finding those pockets of excellence or the folks that have distinguished themselves in that way. How would I find them? Where would I look? What do they look like?
So let me take the last one of that to frame my answer. In addition to doing this quantitative work of, how much do kids learn in a year, we've also done a fair amount of qualitative work of trying to get under the hood of charter schools. And most of that work has not happened in New York, but I do think that the work generalizes. And we've been able to identify some pretty interesting characteristics of the super effective schools. So let me run down a couple of those. Clearly, human capital is 90% of the game. And so a strong leader that has a very clear, very articulate vision of what the school is about. And the school is about making kids learn. It's not about a safe environment necessarily, although that's important, but really the focus of the school, the purpose of the school is helping kids move forward academically. That vision embraced by 100% of the adults in the building. And that is a really hard thing to do. There are lots of pressures that leaders have. They have turnover, they have necessity to meet a particular set of criteria about what their teachers look like. It's really hard to make sure that you've got absolutely everybody on board. But the schools that have that have such an advantage. because there's no dickering around then about what business you're in. And the conversations then are about what are you doing to move kids ahead. Having said that, I think a really coherent curriculum, I think lots of information about how kids are doing, frequently assessed. It doesn't have to be with NWEA or with interim assessments. It can be in a variety of ways, but using that data for very clear conversations with teachers about who's lagging behind and what things you need to do to move them forward, and making sure that those steps actually take root, are the kinds of things that we see in schools where we see them improving, and we're seeing a significant improvement in what happens to their kids.
That's super helpful, although, I mean, a really tall order. I'll say I was in a school recently where the school leader is really working hard to put the school on a totally different trajectory, and realizing how much a challenge of leadership it is to have every other person in that building feel the sense of urgency that she just very visibly was manifesting in every, particle of her being. And really hard stuff you guys are doing. I've said that there is something magical about the charter leader who thinks that essentially on their own and through their leadership they can reverse what is the cumulative impact of so many long-standing social factors that are still, making a huge difference in the lives of kids on a daily basis. So kudos to all of you, and thank you for doing that every day and sometimes well into the night. So do you have any words of wisdom for the folks here? And there are folks here, I should mention, from every region in the state of New York that run charter schools. But certainly up here in Syracuse, New York in particular, not too far from Rochester, where you have roots, and Rochester showed some love a minute ago. Do you have any words of wisdom for charter folks here?
So, yes, I do. One, you've picked a really good place to be. And I say that because most of the districts in whose environments you operate are in such a world of hurt that you have a marvelous opportunity to step out and demonstrate an alternative. The second thing I would say is that I think you actually have a pretty interesting labor market in front of you. And while you don't have the 116 higher education institutions that sit in New York City, or the 84 that sit in Boston, to have just an incredibly rich labor market, I think the economic trends that have happened over the last 15 years in Troy, in Syracuse, in Rochester, in Buffalo, Binghamton, you name it, have actually produced a cadre of folks who could potentially be amazing assets to you. And whether that's that they're engaged in producing hands-on learning experiences, there may not be classroom teachers, but they could be hands-on learning experience guides and counselors, whether they're people who can organize different kinds of learning opportunities for kids, whether it's taking kids for a day-long experience inside of companies or inside of factories or whatever. I think there's a lot more openness to that in upstate than you get anywhere in the downstate area. And I'd love to see more of the collaboration across the communities here to make some of that happen.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And I will also say, speaking as someone who founded a charter school in Troy, New York, I definitely did a lot of selling that Troy is the new Brooklyn. So spread the word, true story. There is a wine bar. And in a charter school? No. That's the school I founded, friends. although the founder of the wine bar was a charter school employee. So, synergies, yes. Chicken, egg, eternal debate. And so as sort of a last topic, when we talked earlier, I was really fascinated by our conversations linking the concept of education in charter schools with the work that you've done around monopolies. Mind saying a little bit about that? And I don't mean the board game.
So, yeah, it's going to take a minute to set this up, so please indulge me. When I went to graduate school, I was really interested in trying to figure out whether there were common milestones when industries that had been previously monopolistic had competition introduced. And so I started actually looking at healthcare, was my first industry that went competitive. The introduction of HMOs and prospective payment, for anybody who's really a healthcare nerd, really broke open the monopoly of the local doctor assigning, controlling what happened in hospitals and assigning treatment, and insurance companies just paying that. And from that, I actually started looking at airline deregulation and trucking, and then once I got into common carriage, then it was telecommunications and the electric industry, all of which were restructuring. You remember AT&T and the breakup of the Bell system. Well, it turns out that there are very, very predictable milestones about what happens when the competitive entrant tries to break open a monopoly. And guess what, guys? You are the competitive entrant. That doesn't surprise you. But we never talk about the monopoly. I mean, there's all kinds of nasty language that the establishment uses to describe you. We have never used the M word, and I don't know why. Because everything that you see in a local school district is entirely monopolistic behavior. And it's monopolistic behavior that has been completely co-opted by established interests. So let's just call it what it is. Well, along the way, the first thing they try to do when there's a new entrant is just ignore you because they figure you'll go away, you will fail. The second thing is they try to establish higher barriers to entry. And you can see this in what's happened in the kinds of things that they want now, so that they've taken away some of the discretion around staffing, and they've taken some of the discretion around finances. And so they're raising the entry barrier. The third thing they do is that they try a public relations campaign, and you can see, you guys were in New York State when the AFT flipped the switch. Do you remember the day when all of a sudden the language changed? Right? You were no longer just charter schools, you were the Billionaires Boys Club, right? And you were the nasty capitalist-supported, instruments
Does anyone here have like Wall Street hedge fund money in a secret like Scrooge McDuck bank vault somewhere in your school?
Right. So, but here's the part about this. There was actually, did you guys know about the memo, right? The memo that came out that this was a concerted focus group communications project by AFT. They did thousands of focus groups to come up with what they found to be the most offensive language. And then they spread it around and said, here's the day it's going to drop. And literally it was like throwing a switch. So they've done the sort of the smear campaign. And now we're into what is the fourth phase, and that is that they're hurling legal challenges, that they have deep pockets and they know it, and they're going to try to run folks into the ground. So they're doing legislative initiatives, they're doing lawsuits, they're doing referenda on elections, they're paying for massive campaigns to try to turn the tide. And I think there's going to be much more of that in the next period of time. I don't think California is a one-off. I don't think the strikes that we saw in LA and Oklahoma are one-offs. I think this is a protracted strategy, and we're going to see more of it. So I want to know, what's the countervailing that you folks are ready to do? What are the things that we can clearly claim are happening? We know that adults come first, right, in the monopoly. That's not news, but we should really press that. We should absolutely press that there is a systemic disregard of persons of color and low income, and that is a pervasive practice. We should absolutely speak about the fact that there's an unwillingness to address their own quality issues. I think there's a campaign there that can be unbelievably powerful in pushing back on some of this nasty rhetoric, and also start to engage with the voter community, because I think this is where the fight is going to go. And I want all of you to be the warriors for it.